My partner keeps mentioning things about my appearance, but when confronted claims to not care. Am I taking this the wrong way? 7 years. The weight of those words sat heavily on my chest as I thought about our journey together. 7 years of shared laughter, quiet evenings, heated arguments, and the silent spaces in between. 7 years of trying to make a life together, to understand each other, to love in the way we both needed but not always succeeding. And in those 7 years, I couldn't shake the growing realization that, despite our history, there was something missing. I've always known that insecurity was a shadow I carried, trailing behind me no matter where I went. It wasn't an easy burden to bear, but I had learned to live with it, to silence the nagging doubts as best as I could. Yet, with him, the shadows seemed to grow. It was as though his very presence gave it life, amplifying its voice. He was never my hype man, never the partner who showered me with compliments or made me feel like I was the most beautiful woman in the room. And that was fine, or at least I told myself it was fine. Not everyone is wired that way, right? People express love differently. Some show it with words, others with actions. But over the years, I started to wonder, was it love at all, or just indifference cloaked in the guise of pragmatism? He never really commented on my appearance, except, of course, when he did. And those comments weren't the sweet, affirming kind that might buoy my spirits. No, they were cutting, even if cloaked in the guise of humor. A joke about my coat. A quip about my shoes. A casual remark about my jeans that left me second-guessing every outfit I put on. Mom jeans, he'd call them, even though they weren't. But once the label was there, it didn't matter if it was true or not, I could never wear them again without hearing his voice in my head. And yet, despite his apparent disinterest in my looks, he always seemed to notice everyone else's. Women, men, it didn't matter. He had this uncanny ability to zero in on the smallest details, the things most people would overlook. A stranger's haircut. The way someone walked. The fit of a jacket. He'd casually point these things out, not maliciously, but as though cataloging the world around him. Look at her shoes, he'd say, or, he looks like he hasn't slept in weeks. Observational, yes, but it stung all the same. Why could he see so much in others, notice them so fully, and yet seem so blind to me? I tried to tell myself it wasn't personal, that this was just who he was. An analytical mind. A person who noticed everything. But then there were the stories. Stories he'd told me about his past relationships, shared in the unguarded moments when we were still learning about each other. I remember one night, early in our relationship, when he spoke about a previous girlfriend. She was beautiful, he said, striking, even. The kind of woman who turned heads when she walked into a room. She made me feel more attractive just by being with her, he admitted with a chuckle, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe it was. Maybe everyone feels that way when they're with someone stunning. But I couldn't help but compare myself to her, to the image he had painted so vividly in my mind. Was I that for him? Did I make him feel more attractive, more confident, just by standing at his side? The answer felt like a resounding no. I wasn't the kind of woman who turned heads. I was fine average, at best. And if he noticed everything, then surely he had noticed that too. Over time, his comments, both the ones he made and the ones he didn't, started to gnaw at me. I told myself not to take it personally, not to let it get under my skin. But it did. It burrowed deep, planting seeds of doubt that grew into thorny vines. I began to wonder if I was being too sensitive, if my insecurities were clouding my perception. But then again, wasn't a partner supposed to lift you up, to make you feel beautiful and cherished, even on your worst days? Or was that just a fantasy, something people only experienced in movies and novels? I watched him as he moved through the world, seemingly oblivious to the turmoil brewing inside me. He was kind in other ways, of course. Thoughtful, even. But his kindness felt practical, not passionate. He'd pick up groceries without being asked, fix the leaky faucet in the kitchen, and make sure my car was serviced before a long drive. These were good things I appreciated, but they weren't the things my heart yearned for. What I craved was something deeper, something intangible. I wanted to feel seen. Truly seen. And loved, not in spite of my flaws, but because of them. The longer we were together, the more I started to question if I was asking for too much. Maybe it wasn't fair to expect him to be something he wasn't. Maybe I should be grateful for what we had. After all, 7 years is no small feat. Relationships are hard work, and perfection doesn't exist. But as these thoughts churned in my mind, one question kept rising to the surface, refusing to be ignored. Was I settling for a love that left me feeling unseen? It wasn't just the casual mention of his ex-girlfriend that lingered in my mind, it was the way he had said it. A wistful tone, almost nostalgic, like he was recounting a fond memory instead of merely stating a fact. She made me feel more attractive just by being with her, he had said, a soft chuckle escaping his lips as if it were an anecdote he'd told 100 times. I remember sitting there, the words settling heavily between us, wrapping around my chest like a tightening band. I laughed it off at the time, brushed it aside with a smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. But later, in the quiet solitude of my own thoughts, I replayed that moment over and over again. Did I make him feel attractive? Did he feel proud to be with me, to walk into a room with my hand in his? Or was I just there? A placeholder? A partner of convenience? That memory lingered like a stubborn bruise, one I tried to ignore but always seemed to bump against. And as the years passed, it seemed to color the way I heard his words, especially the little comments he made about me. They were small, almost innocuous on the surface, but they added up over time, like tiny pebbles accumulating until the weight of them became impossible to ignore. It was the little things, always the little things. My coat was the first thing he ever commented on, and at the time, I thought nothing of it. "Is that a new coat?" he had asked, his tone light, teasing. Very practical looking. There was no malice in his voice, just a hint of amusement, but it stayed with me. Every time I put it on after that, I saw it through his eyes, practical, not stylish. Functional, not beautiful. I started wearing it less, opting instead for something else, anything else, in the hope that he might notice and say, "Oh, that's nice." But he never did. Then it was the shoes. "Oh, I see you're wearing those comfortable shoes again," he'd say with a grin, his eyes flicking down at my feet. The first time, I laughed it off, even joking back, "Hey, comfort over fashion, right?" But the second, third, and fourth times, it didn't feel so funny anymore. I started second-guessing every shoe purchase, wondering if they were too comfortable looking, too plain, too dull. I even went so far as to buy a pair of trendy, uncomfortable boots I didn't particularly like, just to see if he'd notice. He didn't. Or if he did, he didn't say anything. The jeans were the worst. I'd carefully curate the wardrobe of different styles: skinny jeans, cropped flares, high-waisted, but to him, they were all the same. "Mom jeans," he'd call them, his tone teasing but firm. "You and your mom jeans." I'd argue back, defending my choices, insisting that they weren't mom jeans, that he didn't know what he was talking about. But his words stuck like burrs, sharp and stubborn. I started avoiding those jeans, too, even though I loved them. Even though I had chosen them because they made me feel good. Because once he'd said it, I couldn't wear them without feeling like a walking cliché, a frumpy, unremarkable woman in mom jeans. The comments weren't constant, but they came often enough to leave a mark. My hair wasn't immune, either. "I don't think a ponytail really suits you, do you?" he'd ask casually, as if it were a passing thought. I'd stiffen, my hand unconsciously reaching up to touch the hair I had carefully tied back that morning. "What's wrong with it?" I'd ask, defensive. "Nothing, really. It's just Not my favorite, he'd reply with a shrug, as though it was no big deal. And maybe to him, it wasn't. But to me, it felt like another tiny pebble added to the pile. Then there was the time I cut my hair. It was a bold move for me, something I'd been contemplating for months but hadn't quite mustered the courage to do. When I finally took the plunge, I came home feeling excited, nervous, hopeful. I wanted him to notice, to say something, anything that made me feel validated in my choice. Instead, he glanced at me and said, "Hi. That's different." No smile. No warmth. Just those two words, hanging in the air like an unfinished thought. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just his way. He wasn't the type to gush. But it hurt all the same. And it wasn't just the comments. It was the silences, too. The moments when I'd put on something new or try a different hairstyle, hoping for a reaction that never came. The times I'd walk into the room, feeling confident, only to be met with indifference. I told myself not to care, that it didn't matter. But deep down, I wanted to matter. I wanted to be seen. Every comment, every joke, every moment of silence chipped away at me, little by little. It wasn't just about the clothes or the shoes or the hair. It was about what those comments represented. They made me feel like I wasn't enough, like no matter what I did, I could never quite measure up, not to his ex, not to his ideal, not to the unspoken standard he seemed to hold me to. And the worst part was, he didn't seem to realize the impact his words had. To him, they were just jokes, just observations. To me, they were reminders of all the ways I fell short. I tried to tell myself I was being too sensitive, that I was reading too much into things. But how could I not? How could I ignore the growing pile of pebbles, each one pressing down on me a little harder than the last? How could I not wonder if, deep down, he wished I were someone else? Someone more stylish, more confident, more beautiful. Someone like her. The comments about my glasses were the latest addition to the ever-growing list. He had a knack for picking apart the small details, the ones that didn't seem significant until he pointed them out. It started innocuously enough, a light-hearted joke about how my glasses reminded him of a certain TV character. I won't say which one, but let's just say it wasn't someone you'd want to emulate in terms of style. At first, I laughed along, trying to match his humor. But as the days passed and the jokes continued, the laughter started to feel hollow. It wasn't the first time he'd said something about my glasses, either. He'd already dubbed my previous pair grandma glasses, a label that clung to them like a stain. I had loved those glasses once. They were bold and different, a little quirky, exactly what I wanted them to be. But after his comment, I couldn't look at them the same way. Every time I wore them, I felt self-conscious, like I was embodying the caricature he'd drawn with his words. Eventually, I stopped wearing them altogether. They joined the pile of discarded items in the corner of my closet, a growing graveyard of things I once loved but no longer dared to use. When he made the latest joke, I felt something in me snap, not in an explosive way, but quietly, like the final thread of a rope fraying under pressure. I couldn't keep brushing it off, pretending his words didn't bother me. I wanted to confront him, to lay it all out and make him understand how these little comments, these jokes, made me feel. But confrontation had never been my strength, and with him, it always seemed to backfire. He had a way of turning things around, making me feel like I was overreacting or taking things too seriously. I was just joking, he'd say, and I'd be left wondering if maybe he was right. Maybe I was too sensitive. This time, I decided to try a different approach. Instead of arguing or shutting down, I asked him calmly, almost timidly, to show me pictures of glasses he liked. I thought it was a reasonable request. If he had such strong opinions about what didn't work, surely he had an idea of what did. Just show me a few examples, I said, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. I really want to know what you like. He looked at me, a flicker of surprise crossing his face, as if he hadn't expected me to take his comments seriously. "I don't know," he said with a shrug. "I don't really care about that stuff." The words hit me like a slap, though he probably didn't mean them that way. He didn't care. Then why did he keep making these comments? Why did he keep pointing out the things he didn't like if he didn't care? I pressed him, trying to keep my frustration in check. "If you don't care, then why do you keep saying these things? Why do you even notice?" He sighed, the kind of sigh that spoke of exasperation, like I was asking something unreasonable. "I'm just making observations," he said, his tone defensive. "It's not a big deal." Not a big deal. That phrase again, the one he always used to dismiss my feelings. It wasn't a big deal to him, but it was to me. And the fact that he couldn't or wouldn't see that made it hurt even more. "It feels like you are criticizing me," I said softly, trying to make him understand without pushing him away. "I just want to know what you think looks good. I want to look good for you." For a moment, he didn't say anything. He just looked at me, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "You look fine the way you are. I don't need you to change anything." Fine. That word hung in the air like a bad smell. Fine was the opposite of what I wanted to be. I didn't want to be fine, I wanted to be beautiful. I wanted him to look at me the way he used to talk about his ex, with admiration and pride. But instead, he looked at me with indifference, as though I were a painting he'd grown used to seeing on the wall there, but no longer remarkable. I tried to explain that to him, to tell him how his comments made me feel, but he shut it down. "You're overthinking this," he said, his tone dismissive. "I really don't care about stuff like that." And that was the crux of it, wasn't it? He didn't care. Not about my glasses, not about my shoes, not about my hair or my jeans. He didn't care about any of it. And maybe that should have been a relief, but it wasn't. Because if he didn't care about those things, then what did he care about? And why did it feel like I was the only one trying to bridge the gap between us? I went to bed that night with his words swirling in my mind, trying to make sense of it all. Was I being too sensitive, as he claimed? Or was this a sign of something deeper, something more troubling? As I lay there staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder, was I asking too much, or was I simply asking the wrong person? His refusal to offer an opinion on the glasses wasn't what hurt the most. It was the flatness in his tone, the absence of care behind the words. "It doesn't matter what I like," he had said, and in those words, I heard a truth I didn't want to confront. Maybe he was trying to be kind, to deflect the conversation and reassure me in his own way. But what I heard was something else entirely, that no matter what I wore, no matter how I looked, it would never be enough to spark the kind of admiration or excitement I craved from him. When I told him how his words made me feel, that they felt like confirmation I would never be overly attractive to him, he didn't argue. He didn't protest or try to convince me otherwise. He just said nothing. The silence was deafening. I waited, giving him time to respond, to say anything that might soothe the ache spreading through my chest. But he didn't. And in that moment, his silence spoke louder than any words could have. I wish I could say I brushed it off, that I convinced myself I was being too sensitive and moved on. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about it. His indifference felt like a mirror reflecting back all the doubts I'd tried to bury over the years. Was I making something out of nothing? Was this just another symptom of my own insecurities? Or was it a crack in the foundation of our relationship, one I had been too afraid to see until now? The next few days passed in a blur, each moment tinged with the weight of that unresolved conversation. I tried to act normal, to keep up the routines of our life together, but inside, I felt like I was unraveling. Every time he looked at me or didn't look at me, I wondered what he was thinking. Did he see me, really see me? Or was I just there? A familiar figure occupying space in his life, but not his heart. It wasn't just about the glasses or the clothes or the hair. Those were symptoms, not the disease. The real issue was something deeper, something harder to articulate. It was about feeling valued, cherished, admired. About wanting to be seen through his eyes as someone worth celebrating, not just tolerating. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized I hadn't felt that way in a long time. One evening, as we sat on the couch in silence, I found myself staring at him, studying the lines of his face, the way his brows furrowed slightly as he scrolled through his phone. He looked so at ease, so unaware of the storm raging inside me. I wanted to reach out to him, to bridge the distance between us, but I didn't know how. "Do you think we're okay?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, startled, as if the question had caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone cautious. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "Do you think we're good? As a couple, I mean." He hesitated, and that hesitation felt like a knife twisting in my gut. "I think so," he said at last, his words slow and deliberate. "Why wouldn't we be? Why wouldn't we be?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to answer. How could I explain the 1,000 little moments that had chipped away at my confidence, the quiet doubts that had grown into a cacophony of uncertainty? How could I make him understand that it wasn't just about what he said or didn't say but about how those things made me feel? "I don't know," I said finally, my voice breaking. I don't feel like I matter to you. Not in the way I want to." He frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "Of course you matter to me," he said, as if that settled it. But the words felt hollow, like a rote response to a question he didn't fully understand. "I don't mean matter in the practical sense," I said, my frustration bubbling to the surface. "I know you care about me. You take care of me. But do you see me? Do you love me for who I am? Or do you just tolerate me?" His eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, I thought he might say something that would change everything, that would make me feel like the doubts and insecurities had all been in my head. But instead, he said nothing. And that silence, once again, said it all. In the days that followed, I thought a lot about our relationship, about the love we had built, in the ways it had both sustained and wounded me. 7 years is a long time to be with someone, and the thought of walking away was terrifying. But staying in a love that made me feel invisible was even scarier. I realized that no matter how much I cared for him, no matter how much I wanted to make it work, I couldn't keep erasing parts of myself to fit into a mold that would never feel right. Eventually, I made the hardest decision of my life. I sat him down one evening and told him how I felt, not just about the comments or the indifference, but about the bigger picture. I told him I needed more, and that I wasn't sure he could give it to me. He looked hurt, confused, maybe even a little angry. But he didn't argue. He didn't fight for me. And that, more than anything, confirmed what I already knew. Walking away wasn't easy. It felt like tearing apart the fabric of my life, unraveling everything I had worked so hard to build. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: freedom. Freedom to be myself, to rediscover the parts of me I had buried in the name of love. Freedom to believe that I deserved more. I still think about him sometimes. I wonder if he ever realized the impact his words and his silences had on me. I wonder if he ever missed me, if he ever regretted not fighting harder to keep me. But those thoughts don't consume me the way they used to. Because now, I know that I'm worth fighting for, even if I'm the only one doing the fighting. Was I being too sensitive? Maybe. But in the end, sensitivity isn't a weakness. It's a sign of knowing what you need and having the courage to demand it. And that, I've learned, is the greatest strength of all.